people talk about political bias in newspapers. Yes, a lot of reporters, editors, and owners lean one way or the other. Billy Morris was a Republican. Billy Morris told every newspaper in his enterprise, you will write an editorial endorsing Donald Trump. Okay, that's biased. He's like Fox News biased. Other than that, Billy did not meddle in the daily workings of the Homer News.
Did y'all do it? Did y'all do an editorial endorsing Donald Trump?
Actually, it was funny because Dee McKenzie was publisher then, and Clarion wrote one, but she just couldn't ask the Homer News to do that. She let us off the hook. But anyway, my point is that, of course, human beings will have biases because they're human beings.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. On September 10th, conservative political organizer Charlie Kirk was assassinated while speaking at Utah Valley University. On September 17th, hundreds of mourners gathered on the beach in Homer to remember the slain activists at a memorial service partially organized by Alaska State House Representative Sarah Vance. Homer News journalist Chloe Plesnek attended that outdoor memorial service and wrote a story about it that appeared in the September 25th paper version of the newspaper, as well as on the Homer News website. Representative Vance took offense to the coverage provided by Plesnek. In a September 25th letter to the corporate owners of Homer News, she expressed her outrage, calling out the use of terms such as far-right and Christian nationalist as prejudicial labels. She went on to highlight what she considers to be the historic bias at the Homer News and stated that, quote, this article represents the peak of a long-standing pattern of left-wing slant, end quote. The result was that Carpenter Media almost immediately removed Plesnek's article from the Homer News website and later replaced it with an edited version that removed Plesnek's byline. The social media commentary in both conservative and progressive circles was fierce, with folks on the right arguing that the Homer News should be ashamed of its coverage, and those on the left arguing that the unauthorized editing of Plesnek's article without input from either her or her editor, Aaron Thompson, was un-American censorship. We will explore the ins and outs of this story. We will hear from today's guest, Michael Armstrong, who spent over 20 years at the Homer News. Tomorrow, we will hear from the lone full-time news reporter, Jake Dye, at the Peninsula Clarion, based in Kenai. I did invite my colleague and former podcast guest, Representative Sarah Vance, onto the show, but the timing did not work out. Now to today's guest. He is the former editor of the Homer News, Michael Armstrong. Michael moved to Alaska from Florida in 1979. After a decade in Anchorage working as a freelance reporter at the ADN and as an adjunct English professor at UAA, he and his wife, Jenny Stroyek, moved to Homer when Jenny became co-owner of the Homer Bookstore. In 1999, Michael began working at the Homer News, where he remained until 2022, retiring as editor of that paper. Michael has published many short stories in publications like the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, as well as numerous anthologies. His novels include After the Zap, Agvik, Bridge Over Hell, The Hidden War, and most recently, Truck Stop Earth. Michael Armstrong, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
And I guess, the acute issue is the coverage of the Charlie Kirk memorial service in Homer. My understanding is that Sarah Vance wrote the corporate owners a letter. They pulled the article down. It was down for, 12 hours a day. I don't know.
Yes.
And then it was put back up with edits. And no one in Homer, as far as I know, was aware that edits were being made. I don't know if you know any more of that story and could correct anything I just said.
That's what I understand. And Aaron Thompson's now was editor of the Clarion. When I left, she became editor of Homer News. And then when Mark Sabatini left the Digital Empire, she became editor of the Empire. So she's like running three papers. She is Sound Publishing's newspaper editor in Alaska. So she's kind of running ragged. And I know Chloe Plesnek had been doing freelance work with us when I was editor. Good staff. Chloe grew up at Homer, has some radio experience, good, honest, decent reporters. So I've been keeping in touch with them. I do know that the story was taken down. I do know that it was put back up, edited. The paragraphs objected to were cut a little bit and put at the end of the article. And it says Homer News staff instead of Chloe Plesnek.
Which I think might be for her own protection.
I don't know. I don't know. And, Homer News staff would be what you would put on a press release from the hospital announcing a new
Right.
doctor. So that in itself is a little unusual. And I don't know who in the corporation touched that, who edited that. I don't think Chloe or Aaron were involved in that. So with the push and pull of web versus print stories, particularly with a weekly paper, there's always, if you've got a story that's breaking news, push it to the web. So it was very common for me to write a story for the web with whatever details I had, and then say it came out on a Monday, do a follow-up story for the Thursday print edition with more details. So you might have, let's say you had your original web story and you added a couple of details. You would say that in the editor's note. This story's been updated to include this information. So basically letting people know that the original web story you saw is now been updated, and this is how it's been updated, just to be open about changes to me. And even if it's a spelling error, you put that. You'll see that in the New York Times. That's what you do in web updates.
There's the first sentence, which basically just gives, hundreds of people gathered to remember Charlie Kirk, who'd been shot and killed on September 10th. And then it's that next sentence. Kirk was a far-right political activist and Christian nationalist icon. Sarah Vance felt that using the terms far-right and Christian nationalist was partisan.
Hate baiting, she called it.
I'm curious, are those terms hate baiting, far-right and Christian nationalist?
Well, apparently to Sarah Vance, they are.
I feel like this is just a product of being a politician in late September 2025. I don't know anymore. What words are we allowed to use and what words are we not allowed to use? Because there are certain people who use the term Christian nationalist without embarrassment. They don't think of that as a derogatory term. Far right, I don't know that far right is necessarily a derogatory term.
No, it's a descriptive term. Essentially, if you're not Lisa Murkowski, then that's far right. I mean, in today's politics, it's also, MAGA Republican. But
if I'm thinking honestly, given the context that I read the edited version first and then read the unedited version, and when I read the unedited version, I'm like, when I look at this through Sarah Vance's eyes, I can see this as being inflammatory. This is not how Sarah Vance would like this article to read. But I'm just curious, through an editor's eyes like yours, do you think that the version that appeared, would you have tried to soften it at all?
I want to be careful here, first of all, because I respect Aaron as an editor. The decision I made when I left was, this is no longer my paper. This is her paper. If she wants to ask me ideas and thoughts, I'm all ears. I feel uncomfortable saying, this is what I would have done. Certainly, I could say, I would have been careful because of the potentially inflammatory nature of just the whole Charlie Kirk thing. Just how for some people, what was the columnist of the Washington Post, she said I was fired because I didn't have the obligatory bowing down and throwing ashes on my face attitude. For some people, if you say anything negative, well, that's what Jimmy Kimmel got in trouble.
In the New York Times today, there was an article about 145 people who lost their jobs for saying something negative about Charlie Kirk, including a nurse who made, I guess what might have been like an inappropriate joke. She says, I certainly didn't wish harm on him, but she was fired from her nursing job because of a joke that was overheard at the nursing station.
Yeah, certainly I would have been sensitive about it. From what I understand, they were. But it's hard to tell now because now we have this edited version. I hope that sound didn't run that by Sarah Vance and say, this is okay.
They didn't. I was texting with Sarah Vance. Sarah Vance was unaware. She thought the story was down. I told her I was confused because I read the edited version and I had no idea why you were so upset. And then I sent her the link to the edited version.
It would have been nice if Sarah Vance had called Aaron Thompson up and said, I have some issues. Any citizen has a right to criticize the newspaper's coverage. And in a community newspaper, even more so. That's fine. She could have said, oh, I was expecting this, blah, 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 and you did this. And that would have been fine. The conversation with the editor, maybe they rethink it. And that's how it should go.
Right.
She comes in full throttle, pretty much saying, nice paper you got there. Too bad if something would happen to it. You know, it's Donald Trump thuggery. It's what they did to Jimmy Kimmel.
I tried to explain to Sarah, I said, look, I worry about our small town newspapers. With the limited knowledge that I have, there aren't many small town newspapers in Alaska that can afford to lose any subscribers at all.
The irony of this whole thing is Chloe did not have to cover that event at all. She didn't have to go. And I've been to like these conservative, where you're like the only reporter in the room and they're all looking daggers at you like, and making you feel like you're the enemy. She didn't have to do that, you know.
Well,
but she did. And she live streamed it. She gave Sarah Vance 10 minutes of her thoughts on the importance of Charlie Kirk. She didn't have to do that, but she did. Just because she did it and just because she went doesn't mean she has to make some legislator look wonderful. Their job is to look at what, you know, they're saying and put it in context.
There's many people on both sides who would prefer not to have to answer difficult questions or explain their positions.
Over the years, I made a truce with Sarah Vance, but I have to say she was not one who was open about working with the press. And I say it for KBBI as well. You know, Paul Seaton.
Paul Seaton was the previous representative for Homer.
I'm in town for, you know, the break, you know, let's get together and talk about what's going on in the legislature. You know, Gary Stevens.
Gary Stevens is a senator for Homer.
Never had that offer from Sarah Vance. She might hold town hall, but a sit down with a reporter where we talk about what's going on. Nope. She wouldn't do that. On the other hand, when I retired, she sponsored with Gary Stevens a legislative committee. Yeah, citations. Thank you, Sarah Vance. Thank you for honoring my work.
Okay, let's bounce back and talk more about you. Tell us a little bit about your early life.
I was born in Virginia. My parents met at the University of Virginia. My dad was a doctor. My mom was a nurse. And when I was a boy, I moved with my family, my older sisters, to Tampa, Florida. So that's where I grew up. I lived on the grounds of TV hospitals until I was about 10, like living in a gated community with a highly infectious disease. And that was a cool experience. We had a lot of World War II refugees. So my grandmother, who we called Nine, which is the Welsh word Anne Hughes Jander, was a writer. But she did things like she wrote for magazines. In her 50s, she developed rheumatoid arthritis and came to live with our family. Actually lived nearby for a while and then was living with us. And I didn't know it at the time, but she was dying. She was essentially in hospice care with my dad, who was a doctor, my mom, a nurse. And Nine, we shared a room. So she's in, you know, this big bedroom. And she's in a hospital bed, and I'm there, and she'd tinkle the bell and say, could you give me this, give me that? But she also told stories. She'd make up stories about Ricky Licky, the good dragon. Wales has this whole history of dragons. And so she talked about the dragon lore of Wales. She utterly terrified me because she told me that if children were out after dark, the bad dragons would come and take you away. And one time I was coming home, pushing my trike across a soggy field, and I got stuck. It was getting darker and darker, and I was absolutely convinced that I was going to get eaten by dragons. So she had a great influence on me.
How old were you when you shared a room with her?
I was 6. Yeah, I guess actually 6 and 7. She died shortly before Christmas in 1963. My dad went to private practice, moved to another part of town, and I was there all through high school, then moved to Sarasota, Florida, where I went to New College of Florida, which is in the news a lot these days because of the whole DeSantis takeover. I graduated from New College with a degree in humanities, literature, and philosophy. I'd always known I wanted to be a writer, but I couldn't quite figure out how to do that.
You had your degree in humanities, then what happened?
Backing up a little bit, in high school, I worked on the school newspaper. I went to a Jesuit high school for a couple of years and learned the rigors of the Jesuit form of education. And then I went to a public high school in Tampa and was on Literary Magazine. And I knew then I wanted to be a writer. It was one of those things. This is what I'm going to do with my life. When I went to New College, my advisor, Mac loved science fiction. It was a literature I learned to love and still love. Mac loved science fiction. He's a poet. We talked about, what do you want to do? I said, I want to be a writer. And he said, okay, here's what you do. Fill your brain. At New College, you had no required courses. You could take whatever you wanted. It was record, no record, essentially. If you passed the class, it went on your transcript. If you didn't, it's like you never took it. So I had the freedom to take a lot of courses. So that's what I did. I took literature, philosophy. One time I thought, this computer stuff is interesting. Maybe I should learn programming. So I took a class in basic programming. And this is all like the early 70s, 74, graduated 77. I just took a lot of different courses. The summer of 75, so 50 years ago, I applied for a workshop called the Clarion Science Fiction Writers Workshop, which was then in Michigan State University in East Lansing. And I was one of 25. And Clarion has a reputation as being a pretty intensive workshop in the science fiction field. And so I went to it, and I was studying with people like Samuel R. Delany, Roger Zelazny, Joe Alderman, Damon Knight, Kay Wilhelm. It was a transforming experience. But it was the writers I worked with there who influenced me as much as the instructors. Some are published writers. Robert Crace, who's a mystery writer, went there. Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a big name in science fiction, was one of the students. And they become lifelong friends. I still keep in touch with them. And that experience, which essentially taught me what it was to be a writer, gave me some direction. The direction, as most writers know, is you just write. That there is no magic trick to success except just writing. And you write and write, and you put in the miles, you put in the years. And that's what I did. Then I graduated and I didn't know what to do. I bumped around a few years. I would do things like work for a couple of months, quit, live on my savings, write fiction. And then spring of 79, I got drunk with some friends from New College and decided to move to Alaska. Mark and Mo, my friends, actually did move to Alaska the summer of 79, moved to Anchorage. So they had a spare room in Spenard. I came up end of the year in 79, and here I am.
And what'd you do when you got here?
My first job was in journalism because Mark was a circulation director at the Anchorage Times, district manager. I arrived Saturday night, and Sunday morning, Mark says, well, come on, help me deliver papers on down routes. And so the first month I would just go out with Mark and help him deliver papers. And he put me on the books as one of his carriers, and that helped pay the rent. And then in January, I heard about the Young Adult Conservation Program, part of Jimmy Carter's Comprehensive Education Training Act. It was a youth jobs program that Carter had helped get going. And so I went to job service and said, yeah, I heard about this YAC program. What do you got? And the guy says, oh, we've got an opening at U.S. Fish and Wildlife for an archaeological aid. And my sister, Helen, who later moved up to Alaska, was an anthropologist. And I went to interview and they said, oh, you got a college degree. Sure, you're hired. I wound up working on an archaeological site on the Turner River offshoot of the Congacuts in northwest Alaska, about 10 miles from Demarcation Bay. Fly to Fairbanks, hump all your gear to a DC-3, fly to Kaktovik, get on a 206, land on Congacut, little airstrip there, and then do shuttles and a Super Cub to come to the site. So there I am, a Florida boy. I've never been to a northern climate. And I was in the most remote place. And it was pretty life transforming. I fell in love with Alaska. I saw parts of Alaska very few Alaskans have ever seen. When I came back, I started doing freelance work for the Daily News. That was when the Daily News and the Times were in that fierce newspaper war. And the Daily News had been bought by McClatchy. So they had the money to do some really cool stuff. And they started We Alaskans, the Sunday supplement. And I met Pat Doherty. I had heard they were looking for freelancers. And so I had written him. And he said, oh, yeah, happy to meet you. So I basically drove around Anchorage with Pat Doherty talking about writing. I met Linda Crossan, the editor of We Alaskans, who's delightful, an amazing editor, really kind, generous with her time. And she recognized some talent in me and said, write for me. So I did a story about that archaeological dig, and she made her the front page of We Alaskans. And okay, this is cool. Linda was a sort of person who would gently teach me ethics. Like, we don't share our stories with our sources before they're published. So, okay, I didn't know that. She was just delightful. And she did this thing called general delivery, where she would solicit stories from people in the bush and rural Alaska. She cultivated a lot of writers. Dana Stabino was doing a column about what it's like to work on the slope. And it's great stuff. That got me started in Alaska journalism. I should mention, as this sort of historical note, when I moved to Alaska, I sent a story off to the magazine of fantasy and science fiction called Absolutely at Last, This Is It, No More, The Final Pact with the Devil story. It was a pact with the devil story where a writer had made a pact with the devil that the devil would not get his soul if he sold a pact with the devil story. So it was a meta thing. And it was all told in letters. And I sent that off to a magazine of fantasy and science fiction before I left for Alaska. And it got lost in the mail and eventually caught up with me. And I sold the story. So, $75. And that was affirmation that I could actually write and publish. And then I'm writing these freelance stories for the Daily News.
Were you able to support yourself?
I was, barely. One of the things I learned about writing was to live frugally. I was sharing an apartment in McGinnis Street. At one point, I had a roommate, and then later with my sister and brother-in-law. I didn't have a car. I don't think I had health insurance. I was doing a lot of house sitting, but eventually it wasn't a good living. So I got a state job working with Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys as a publication specialist. In theory, I was supposed to be editing the reports that they were putting out. And it turned out to be, I was in Anchorage, my supervisors were in Fairbanks, and I just was fuddling along. So in some ways, it was a dream state job because I got paid really well and I didn't do anything. Sort of embarrassed about it. But I got tired of that. I decided to go to grad school and get my Master of Fine Arts in Writing. So I did that. And coincidentally, I had some elective classes. So I decided to do an archaeological field school. Nununqua site, which is across from Sterling where the moose hits the Kenai. And that's where I met the woman who would become my wife. So Jenny and I met there. So that was very cool. And I went to grad school. I got a teaching assistantship, worked in the program with Ron Spatz and Tom Sexton, and wrote a novel. That was my thesis. And by then I'd sold a couple more short stories.
After the Zap? Was that your first novel?
That was my first one. Yeah, that was my thesis novel. I actually called it People's Republic of Alaska. But yeah, when I sold it, we changed the name to After the Zap. And yeah, I met a couple, Jen and Chris Morris. I actually sold a story about life in Agvik after nuclear war called Going After Agvik. And they both loved it. They helped me get an agent. When I finished the novel, in my thesis, I sent it to Perry Knowles, my agent, and he sold it like the first place he sent it to, which is unheard of. I had a degree in a novel. I was doing adjunct teaching at the University of Alaska. I was in Anchorage then, and Jenny and I were living in Rabbit Creek. And so I would teach mainly English composition, but I taught a couple of writing courses. Anyway, Jenny, my wife, had been manager of the Huffman Book Cache. The Huffman Shopping Center had a bookstore back in the 80s. And one of her employees was Sue Post. Sue Post's brother and mom owned the Homer Bookstore. And so through the Post, I got to know Homer. And in 94, Joy said, hey, Jenny and Sue, do you want to become partners in the bookstore? So they joined the enterprise. And so that kind of gave us an anchor, a way to, place to be in Homer. And I was able to still teach. I taught here at the college, but I was also teaching distance education courses with UAA. I did that for a while. We built a cabin, got settled here, made friends. I actually got clinically depressed in the fall of 98. Part of it was my fiction writing career stalled. It became obvious that even though I'd done all this work as an adjunct, I wasn't going to get a full-time position. There weren't that many tenure-track positions. If you know anything about the university system, they run on adjunct professors. They should have far fewer adjunct professors and more full-time professors. But that's budgets, that's money.
This is like in your mid 40s.
Yeah, so I'm 69, so I turned 40 in 96. So I was 42. I wasn't very good at playing the academic game, and there's a lot of stuff you had to do to basically cozy up to get a position with the state. And I would applied, and there was a fiction writing position in Fairbanks, and I didn't get it. They gave it to somebody from Ohio. That's another thing that the university system does is if you got your education in Alaska, you're no good, How could you possibly be good? It's Alaska. So they'd hire somebody from lower 48. So that was frustrating. So I hit this point, and this job came along at the Homer News, and I thought full-time work, benefits, I needed to do something. So I was an editorial assistant, and it was still old school. People would fax us letters or drop letters off or obituaries. So I spent about half my time typing. I had to take a typing test to get the job. And I was doing cops in courts, the police blotter. I'd go down to the cop shop and get the redacted police blotter, and I'd get the court filings and type those up. And that was the best job I could have to learn everything about the business of being in a newspaper, particularly a weekly paper. We had, 12 people. There were 2 editorial assistants, editor-publisher, managing editor, 3 writers, reporters, 2 graphic artists, 2 salespeople. It was just humming. And that was when the Homer News was still owned by the Washington Post people. Howard Simons had died, but his widow was a partner, and then Marty Cohen. In the 80s, things were booming and there was a lot of money. So the paper was able to get somewhere. But that was starting to get the transition where newspapers were running into trouble. But I started out working with the Homer News of the Washington Post era. Spence was there, Mark Turner was editor, Joel Gay was managing editor. I did that for a couple of years. Homer News sold to Morris Communications, which was interesting because then we're owned by this Georgia good old boy Republican, and who was a nice, sweet man. Billy Morris was generally a kind person, but it was cheap as can be. Put his money into Gulfstream jets and not into reporters. And anyway, I eventually became a reporter in 2003 and did that until I became editor.
I have a question about being the editorial assistant at age 42, having been a professor and having published books. I just wondered if you had any feeling of like that it was beneath you.
When I applied for the job, Turner said, "You're way overqualified for this." And I said, "Yeah, I know." But the thing about Homer is a lot of people here are overqualified for their work. And if you want to be in Homer, people would say, "Oh, I'd love to be in Homer, but I just can't find a job there." I was like, that's not how it works. If you want to be in Homer, if you want to be in this place, it's cool people, beautiful surroundings, you have to be a little creative and you have to work at jobs that maybe you're overqualified for. But first of all, there's value in all work. No job is beneath anybody. People have to build houses. People have to plow roads. All that is good work. And I think we're coming to realize how important that is because there's the need for those jobs in Homer, but people can't live here because there aren't any houses. It's not affordable housing. So anyway, I didn't feel it was beneath me. And also I had learned that take joy in the work you're doing. And I was writing up police blotters, and that was fun. I'd go to the courthouse and chat with the clerks and the cops. I was typing letters of, there was one guy, the World War II vet. The guy had stories. He'd fought with Patton, and he would come in every week with these 3-sentence letters, and I'd type them up, and then I'd chat with him. And he was conservative, but he wasn't flaming right-wing fascist conservatives. He was just a guy who had strong opinions. And so I'm typing up these letters of people who are just amazing individuals. I could take joy in that. One of my jobs was rolling quarters every Thursday. That we had the vending machines, and I'd have to do the accounting for each machine. It was this Zen peace in the middle of chaos. The other thing was I was at a newspaper. And newspapers in those times were just amazing. The people are funny. They were smart. They have interesting stories. It was probably the hardest work I've ever done because you can't slack off. You have to constantly be moving. You have a deadline. And if you don't do all the stuff that has to be done before the deadline, and you're just toast. So the pace was really cool. Just beautiful stuff. Even though I was an editorial assistant and literally using a job skill that I learned my junior year of high school when I took personal typing, it was still great. And also, I was writing fiction at the same time and sending stories out. And so I was getting satisfaction from that.
And when you made the transition to becoming a reporter, did you feel like your talent was being used more appropriately?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Reporters came and went. I think it was when Hal Spence left. They were hiring a reporter, and I applied for it. And Mark Turner hired somebody else. He had more journalism experience. But anyway, later Mark says, I should have given you that job. That one just didn't work out. But anyway, I got a job. I became a reporter.
Do you have any particular memorable stories in that period before you became the editor?
Well, the one that kind of, I think, hit me the hardest was that airport shooting in 2006. It was March of 2006. There had been this drug dealer from Duluth, or J-Dog was his street name. And he was up in Alaska with his girlfriend, their 2 kids, and their pit bull. He was wanted by the U.S. Marshals, and they knew he was at home in Homer. They knew where he was, but it was one of these things like, we got to get this guy in a safe place and arrest him. So the Marshals had concocted this scheme where he had a rental car. So the rental car agent was going to say, hey, you got a cracked windshield on your Jeep, and why don't you come by the airport and swap it out? And the idea was that J-Dog was going to come into the airport to the rental counter, and the U.S. Marshals would come in and tase him, and all would be well. There was this youth and adult choir. We're taking a trip to Italy. So we're talking like 100 people flying out of Homer Airport that afternoon, including Chief of Police's wife. And the Marshals didn't do their intelligence. And so they were expecting a relatively empty airport. And here's filled with all these people. And the troopers had said, we'll help you in any apprehension. But the attachment commander said, under no circumstances do you approach that car if the guy has his kids and his dogs in the car. We want him alone. So J-Dog gets there and he said, can you come in and get the keys? I said, dude, I got my kids in the car. They're in car seats. I got to get them out of the car seats. Here he's this meth head drug dealer, but he's worried about his kids in the car seats. The troopers were like, no, we don't know if he's by himself. We're not in this. But the Homer police were assisting. And the Homer police didn't know there were kids in a car. They maybe should have known, but they didn't. The Marshals didn't tell them this. So the Homer police, a couple of cops, 2 marshals, approach this car. The guy sees them, and he pulls out a handgun, shoots his son in the face, and then shoots himself. And then the police start shooting. And so you wound up with this guy's dead. His 3-year-old son is severely injured. The pit bull's been shot. And this all took place in the parking lot at the Homer Airport with 150 people there. And it was just screwed up. My editor calls me up and says, go check this out. Something domestic violence. I don't know what's going on. So I show up there. It's about 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. And there's a trooper patrol vehicle. There's this car with police tape around it. I take out my camera, and these 2 U.S. Marshals pull up in a van and go, who are you? What are you doing here? What's going on? Let me see my ID. And I'm like, I'm a reporter. Who are you? And I was like, something is really weird going on here. The police and the Marshals were thinking, we just shot a kid. Through our screw up, we just shot a kid. And they were just devastated. And
did he live?
Oh, yeah. But it was a major brain injury. He was in an institution. He's living, but not living. Um, and this is where I learned things like contact wounds to the face, and I was going into some morbid territory. They were able to show through forensics that J-Dog, the father, had shot his son. But remarkably, the daughter, the younger girl, not a scratch.
She was in the back seat?
Both in the back seat. And the boy wasn't hit by any bullets from the cops. I mean, even in this firefight. So the troopers came in, the marshals were out of it. They did their own internal investigation, but the troopers were called in to do the, non-impartial investigation. And that thing just went on for months. This is during the Palin administration. And my editor, Lori Evans, said, keep filing records requests. And so every month would call up and, where's that report? We don't have it yet. We don't have it yet. And I'd file records requests with Palin, the Commissioner of Public Safety, everybody I can think of. And finally, the one, I think it was the deputy commissioner, said, look, when I release this report, I will, gold streak it to you, and you will get first grabs at it. I said, thank you. I had to go to Department of Justice review because Alaska U.S. Attorney's Office couldn't be involved. They just had to see if there could be any charges filed against Homer Police or U.S. Marshals. So I got the report. It was 7:00 at night on a Tuesday. I read it and wrote the story. That was one of the prouder moments. I wrote the story based on the report. And the next day, they released it to everybody. I scooped the Daily News.
I didn't know there were two papers in Homer.
Right.
It seems like Homer's a small market to support two papers.
And the Tribune didn't survive. What happened was that Jim Hornaday, Judge Hornaday, was one of Ted Stevens' law partners back in the day. And the first judge in Homer, we'd had magistrates, but he was district judge. And he wanted to come down hard on drunk drivers. So he kind of made it known that you come to before my court, you're going to do 10 days. He was just like Mr. Hardball. Defense attorneys were constantly saying, no, I don't want this judge. And they'd be assigned to Kenai judges. And so the court system was saying, Jim, you're being such a hard ass. We're going to have to assign you to Anchorage. The Homer News was covering this. And he did not like the coverage that the Homer News did. So it's and plus it was, the Homer News is owned by these Washington Post liberals and blah, blah, blah. They're just a little commie newspaper. So he started the Homer Tribune. And then one of the clerks of the court, Jane Pascal, took over. And if you think about what's happening now with the Homer News and these threats about taking away advertising, the situation then considers, we don't like this commie rag. We're going to put everybody in the Homer Tribune. The Tribune was more conservative and doing good work. One of my coworkers at the Homer News left to take a job there and became editor. Carrie did a fine job. She's a good, honest reporter, Carrie Bristino. And they did a few things I wouldn't have done, like pay for play. Oh, if you put an ad in our paper, we'll do a feature on your business. And you don't do that. But it was a pretty good paper, and we're going to do it better. And they won Best Weekly 3 years in a row, which really pissed us off. But that was the decision of whoever was judging the Alaska Press Club Awards. To their credit, they got recognition.
Why'd they go out of business in 2019?
So they got bought by Alaska Newspapers, Inc. at some point. And I think that was a time period when
they got bought by Anchorage Daily News by the Binkleys in 2019.
A&I bought them.
Okay.
And the Binkleys bought some of the A&I properties.
Got it.
And at one point, they went web only.
Got it.
And it's hard for any newspaper to stay together today. It's just tough times.
You became editor in 2017?
Yep.
Did that feel like the pinnacle of your career? Did it feel like a big deal?
It did. It did. I would have been happy to be managing editor, but we didn't have that. And I've been working with Lori Evans. Lori's classic, good, solid journalist. She worked at the Juneau Empire. She was editor of the Clarion and editor of the Homer News. Just a good person, a good editor, super strong ethics. And I learned a lot from her. But her husband had died and she wanted to take a break. And she was a good, loyal Morris Communications employee. But if she had seen the paper through the recession, that was when Morris cut salaries and laid people off. She decided to take a break. And I remembered something a friend of mine had said, do you want to be on the bus or do you want to be driving the bus? And I said, no, I want to be driving the bus. At that point, I was the only reporter working. We had an opening, but we hadn't filled it. I was doing everything. And I loved it, but it was a lot of work. Lori said, this will be great. The publisher position is going to go to Kenai because Morris was owned the Homer News, the Clarion, the Juneau Empire, and a couple other properties. And Dee Dee McKenzie was the publisher. I'm like, I'm going to apply for this job. The publisher said, great, that would be perfect. So she appointed me editor, and that created another full-time reporter position. And Megan Pacer, who'd been at the Clarion, came down to work in Homer. So it was delightful. I had a reporter who could do the work, and everyone said, oh, it's about time you got the job. So I had a lot of community support. It was a little terrifying, like, oh, I got to fill out this paper, and where do I find these stories? After a while, I got into it, and Lori had made an example. My goal was to tell the stories of the community and to seek diverse voices. I used to take perverse pleasure in getting close to some conservative people at events, like at Sarah Vance Town Hall, and go out to them, hey, you said something interesting. What's your name? You want to quote me in the Homer News? Yeah, of course. You've got something to say. It was fun. It was fun.
Why did you decide to retire in 2022?
So I turned 66 and I hit that magic number with Social Security. And shortly before I decided to retire, I got diagnosed with prostate cancer. And it's like, okay, all right. My dad died young, 58, and men in my family don't necessarily live long lives. And so I thought, I just want to enjoy life, and I don't want to drop dead at 70, working. I want to do something. So, and the prostate cancer, it was like the treatable kind. The prognosis was really good, and I just had to decide the treatments. Plus, I had health insurance. I took a couple of weeks off to get the surgery. So it all came together at a good point. I was like, okay, I have this threatening thing, and I've done what I can for the paper. It's time for me to go. It's time for me to, enjoy life. So it's kind of what I did. I've been writing a lot of short stories. I do a column for Homer News. I came up with this idea of writing from the perspective of an aging person, and so it's called Aging Gracefully. And my friend Bob Barnwell and his wife Lynn started a paper on Seward, the Seward Folly. Bob is actually my brother-in-law's brother, so kind of family friend. And so they asked me to cover city council, which is delightful.
Do you watch it on Zoom?
Yeah, they do YouTube live, and of course it's recorded. And Seward is like Homer with half the population and twice as much tourism. They've got 2 or 3 cruise ships every day. It's just a bustling place. A lot of the issues are the same. We need affordable housing for people who work here. And how do we do that? It's interesting. Their city manager was a former journalist, Kat Sorensen, that I knew when she worked at the Clarion. It's funny. Oh, Kat's the city manager. And she's doing a great job. She's so into it and so responsible and yet super funny. So I'm doing that. And I've got a friend. He's putting together an anthology of science fiction and fantasy stories written by people who have survived cancer. That's on my list to do.
Let's talk a little bit about the current state of Homer News. When did Black Press Media purchase the paper?
In 2017, Morris hires me. I'm promoted to editor. And Morris had owned the Homer News since February 2000. And it was July 2017, like 3 weeks in, Billy Morris, who this family-owned paper enterprise, sells almost everything to Gatehouse Publishing. And Gatehouse is one of those big corporate media corporations where they're owned by hedge funds. So the decisions are not like, let's put out a quality media product. It's like, how much money can we make? So Gatehouse takes over the Homer News. I'm like, okay, I've got to transition at Gatehouse, and how do they do things, and their corporate culture. And I still remember when one of the suits, a couple of, the VPs come in to check us out. And we have me, the editor / reporter. We had a front desk person, and we had an ad sales rep. So 4 of us. And this is in the old Homer News building that once held 12. And the suits come in and they look at us and like, well, we're going to be doing a little right sizing with our properties. They look around and say, but you're right sized already. So Gatehouse bought us. They were an East Coast chain. They had no properties west of Vegas. So all of a sudden they have the General Empire, Peninsula Clarion, and the Homer News in Alaska. They know nothing about Alaska. And they're like, keep setting up these people.
All three of you been owned together previously? Were y'all always a package deal?
Once Morris bought the Homer News, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So, yes, Billy Morris came into before Prudhoe Bay, like weeks before they hit oil. He was a youngster in the corporation. He came up, Daddy, I think we should buy the Juneau Empire. And I'm like, well, okay, son, if you think so. And then 2 weeks later, Prudhoe hits. So Billy started with the Empire, bought the Clarion. He bought Alaska Military, a couple of paper, like weekly papers. He had the Yucca Star. He bought the Milepost, Alaska Magazine. He loved Alaska. He loved to fish and hunt. And then his daughter later became publisher of the Clarion. So then in 2000, it made sense because the Clarion was printing the Homer News. So from 2000 and 2017, Morris owned those three properties as well as the Eagle River Star and a couple other things. Yes, so they sell the Gatehouse. Gatehouse doesn't know what to do with it. And then Sound Publishing comes along. Black Press is the Canadian side of Sound Publishing. David Black, he's out of Vancouver. And they have all these rural Canadian papers, Victoria paper, stuff like that. And they started Sound Publishing south of the Canadian border. So they had Everett Herald, a lot of little weekly papers scattered around Washington State. So that was a much better fit. Canada gets us, Washington gets us. It made perfect sense for the Homer News to be part of that. They bought us in, I think it was May 2018.
Got it. You've mentioned a few times right-leaning versus left-leaning. My inference is that you're left-leaning from today's conversation.
Yeah, I can say that now that I'm retired. But I also would say, like any Alaskan, it's complicated. People talk about political bias in newspapers. And yes, a lot of reporters and editors and owners lean one way or the other. Billy Morris was a Republican. Billy Morris told every newspaper in his enterprise, you will write an editorial endorsing Donald Trump. Okay, that's biased. He's like Fox News biased. Other than that, Billy did not meddle in the daily workings of the Homer News.
Did y'all do it? Did y'all do an editorial endorsing?
Well, actually, it was funny because Dee McKenzie was publisher then, and Clarion wrote one, but she just couldn't ask the Homer News to do that. She let us off the hook. But anyway, my point is that, of course, human beings will have biases because they're human beings. Whenever we had candidate forums, everybody got an invitation. Everybody got the same space. If I'm covering a town hall, I was always trying to get a conservative voice, a liberal voice, a moderate voice, a youth voice, an elder voice. And I tried to make conservative friends, and I made space. Greg Sarber, who writes for Must Read Alaska, he's on the board. Every week he would send me a letter. And I was like, Greg, here you go. Keep it to 350 words. I'm going to put it in the paper. Because he did it every week, I'd say, I'm going to put you down at the bottom because I want to give other people a chance. But if there's space, you'll get in. Oh, yeah, that's fine. That's fair. I'd go like, why do you print his stuff? He's just saying horrible stuff about the pandemic. It's like, because I want to give him a voice. That's what I did.
What are your thoughts about the health of Alaska's media environment and its future?
Sound papers are struggling. Although I'll have to say, when I was editor, my bosses said, the Homer News was the best in terms of ad revenue, was the highest income weekly in their chain. So I must be doing something right. But it's challenged. But the other thing is in this political environment we have, which is what Trump is doing, a lot of people recognizing the value of the press, of a free press and community newspapers. There are towns in the state and in America which have news holes. So there's nobody to cover high school sports. There's nobody to cover city council, all that bread and butter stuff of what makes the community tick. The obituaries, the stories about the elder, you don't get that. And that's a shame. And I think people are beginning to recognize the value of that and at least supporting media that does it. Print journalism is cool. And, as an example, why print journalism is cool is you have that story that Chloe wrote. It's there. It's in print. It's not going away. So that's one example of permanency. There's starting to be ProPublica, national nonprofit newspaper foundations trying to resurrect community journalism. So that's hopeful. The challenge is, how do you pay for it? How do you increase revenue? I'm not a business guy, but what I am as a news guy, I know that if you give people some of the news they want, but also the news they need, they will read and they will advertise. And it's basic stuff. Everybody loves the police blotter. It just gives you this snapshot of what's going on in the town. People want to see who got arrested. They want the obituaries, but they also want to read about the honor roll. How did the Mariners do? What is the menu at the senior center? What is the ferry schedule? All those little things. If you have a newspaper that connects the community, people will see the value and support it. The tragedy is, you may think the Homer News is, left-leaning bias, but what it was one of the few things that's connecting your community together. KVBI is another part. Not many small towns in America can you tune in on the radio and hear council meetings and borough meetings. When somebody dies, we'll put a poster up at the post office. That's the tradition here, but also it's in paper. It's something you can clip out. It's honoring the passing. If you lose those community connections, you lose community.
Are you in Homer till the end?
I think so. I'm supposed to retire to Florida because I grew up in Florida. I don't want to go to Florida. All the things I left Florida for are worse. I love being there. It was a great time to grow up. I love the beaches, have some great friends, but it's just too depressing. It really is depressing. But yeah, Homer is my home, and it's a great community.
Hey, was Truck Stop Earth your last book that you published?
That's my kind of a romantic clef about Homer. It was funny because I had a review of one of my books, and they said, it's pretty good, but it's just not as quirky. So I was like, you want quirky? I'm going to give you quirky. I came up with this James Obadiah, Malachi Osborne, and Call Me Jimmo as my sort of narrative. The whole shtick is he's this person I met, and he's been abducted by aliens. Jimmo's this weird guy. He hitchhikes up to Alaska because he thinks he can come get away from the aliens that have been bothering him all the time. And he admits that he's reality challenged. And then he discovers that Alaska's truck stop Earth for aliens. That sign on the cover, by the way, is the truck stop sign in Sterling.
Looking at the reviews on Amazon, everyone loves it.
Yeah.
Hey, Michael Armstrong, thanks for being on the show today.
Sure. Nice chatting with you, and take care. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call 907-269-0123.